This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, jury deliberations have begun in the trial of Derek Chauvin, the former white Minneapolis police officer charged with murder and manslaughter for killing George Floyd by kneeling on his neck for 9.5 minutes last May. Floyd's death sparked international protests calling for racial justice. Authorities in Minnesota are now bracing for a verdict in one of the most closely watched criminal trials in years. During closing arguments, State Prosecutor Steve Schleicher repeatedly reminded jurors this case was solely about Chauvin's actions, not about policing as a whole.
This use of force was unreasonable. It was excessive. It was grossly disproportionate. It is not an excuse for the shocking abuse that you saw with your own eyes, and you can believe your own eyes. This case is exactly what you thought when you saw it first, when you saw that video. It is exactly that. You can believe your eyes. It's exactly what you believed. It's exactly what you saw with your eyes. It's exactly what you knew. It's what you felt in your gut. It's what you now know in your heart. This wasn't policing. This was murder. The defendant is guilty of all 3 counts. All of them. And there's no excuse.
Derek Chauvin's defense lawyer, Eric Nelson, faulted prosecutors for focusing on the 9 minutes and 29 seconds when his client had his knee on George Floyd's neck.
So we get into the 9 minutes and 29 seconds at this point. The state has really focused on the 9 minutes and 29 seconds. 9 minutes, 29 seconds. 9 minutes, 29 seconds. It's not the proper analysis, because the 9 minutes and 29 seconds ignores the previous 16 minutes and 59 seconds. It completely disregards it. It says, in that moment, at that point, nothing else that happened before should be taken into consideration by a reasonable police officer. It tries to reframe the issue of what a reasonable police officer would do. A reasonable police officer would, in fact, take into consideration the previous 16 minutes and 59 seconds. Their experience with the subject, the struggle that they had, the comparison of the words to actions, it all comes into play. Why? Because human behavior is unpredictable. Human behavior is unpredictable, and nobody knows it better than a police officer.
The closing arguments ended with a rebuttal from State Prosecutor Jerry Blackwell.
When Mr. Floyd is saying, please, please, I can't breathe, 27 times in just a few minutes, you saw it when Mr. Chauvin did not let up and we didn't get up. Even when he passed out, not breathing anymore, he doesn't let up or get up. When he knows he doesn't have a pulse, he doesn't let up or get up. Even when the ambulance comes, he doesn't let up or get up even then. They have to come up and tap him before he will let up and get up off the body of Mr. George Floyd. And they try to resuscitate him in the ambulance, and they never do. He never regains consciousness. He never breathes again. His heart never pumps again. And Mr. George Floyd was deceased. You were told, for example, that Mr. Floyd died because his heart was too big. You heard that testimony. And now, having seen all the evidence, having heard all the evidence, you know the truth. And the truth of the matter is that the reason George Floyd is dead is because Mr. Chauvin's heart was too small.
After after the conclusion of closing arguments, defense lawyer Eric Nelson filed a motion for a mistrial, claiming that recent comments by Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters could be construed as a threat against the jury. During a recent protest in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, over the police killing of Daunte Wright, the 20-year-old black man, Congressmember Waters said protesters should get more, quote, confrontational if Chauvin's not found guilty. Judge Peter Cahill refused to grant a mistrial, but said the comment could lead to the verdict being overturned on appeal. To talk more about the Derek Chauvin trial, we're joined by two guests. In St. Paul, Minnesota, John Thompson is with us, newly elected member of the Minnesota House of Representatives, longtime community activist. In 2016, police killed his friend Philando Sterling during a traffic stop in a suburb of St. Paul. And Nakima Levy-Armstrong is back with us, the Minneapolis-based civil rights attorney, activist, and executive director of the Wayfinder Foundation. Levy-Armstrong previously served as president of the Minneapolis NAACP and is a law professor at the University of St. Thomas. We welcome you, Nakima, back to Democracy Now! Let's begin with you. Assess the closing arguments. What did you think of the prosecution and then of the defense?
I thought the prosecution in this case started strong and ended strong. They did an excellent job reminding the jury of all of the information that had come forward before, including the expert testimony. And they reminded the jury that they could believe what they had seen with their own eyes, not the shenanigans that Eric Nelson tried to put forward with a variety of different theories as to why George Floyd wound up dead on May 25th of 2020.
And Nakima Levy-Armstrong, what do you make of the defense's last-minute attempt, motion for a mistrial based on the comments of Congresswoman Maxine Waters?
I thought, like many aspects of his side of the case and the theories he presented, it did not pass the laugh test. To think that an 82-year-old Congresswoman could be responsible for a mistrial really is absurd. Congresswoman Maxine Waters was well within her rights to show up in Brooklyn Center over the weekend and to stand in solidarity with those who are on the front lines demanding justice for Daunte Wright as well as for George Floyd. And part of the reason for Congresswoman Waters' comments had to do with something known as Operation Safety Net, which is, from my perspective, a reign of terror that has been implemented by the Department of Public Safety in Minnesota and several other police departments in response to the uprisings that happened last summer after George Floyd was killed. We've experienced tear gas, rubber bullets, flashbang grenades, arrests and violence at the hands of law enforcement in Brooklyn Center.
I wanted to ask you about the another protest that happened this weekend that you participated in at the home of the Washington County Attorney Pete Orpett, who filed second-degree manslaughter charges against the former Brooklyn Center police officer Kim Potter for the fatal shooting of Daunte Wright. Can you talk about what happened there and what Orpett said to you?
Yes. So we organized a protest to go to Stillwater, Minnesota, which is about 40 minutes or so outside of the Twin Cities, to the home of Pete Orpett, who is responsible for filing charges in the case of Kim Potter, in which she killed Daunte Wright. We determined that those charges are not strong enough, primarily because of what we've seen happen in a previous case, the case of Muhammad Noor, a Black Muslim Somali former officer who was charged with third-degree murder and convicted for killing Justine Rusacek Damon, a white woman, in 2017. His conviction marked the first time in Minnesota history that an officer had actually been convicted for killing a civilian. Somehow, the government was able to make the crime fit the statute, much to our surprise. And Muhammad Noor filed an appeal in that case, and the Court of Appeals has so far upheld his third-degree murder conviction. And so the facts of this case involving Kim Potter are similar to the facts involving Muhammad Noor. And we do not think that manslaughter charges are enough. We're demanding murder charges in this case for the life of Dante Wright, which was unnecessarily taken. So as we held this protest in front of Pete Orpit's home, we had actually marched down the street, and his neighbors were standing in solidarity with us, throwing up their fists in solidarity, and even chanting Black Lives Matter. Pete Orpit thought that we had left, but we were, again, just marching down the street. And he came outside his home with his wife and started apologizing to his neighbors for our demonstration. Well, Jaylani Hussein, who's been on your show before, executive director of CARE Minnesota, was standing there. And he called Pete Orpit over and said, why don't you apologize to me? Why don't you apologize to us for the undercharging that you've done in this case? So they began a dialogue, and then I walked up and got involved in the dialogue. And I let Pete Orpit know that those charges were unacceptable. We were demanding murder charges, and that we would return back to his home in Stillwater until we see murder charges in this case. We cannot allow prosecutors to undercharge or not charge at all police officers who needlessly take the lives of civilians, as what we have seen in this case.
I wanted to bring Minnesota State Representative John Thompson into this conversation. You've been out in the streets. You're in the legislature now. You were a close friend of Philando Sterling, who was gunned down by police in 2016. Can you talk about this trajectory, if you can call it that, and what you want to see right now and what you're doing in the legislature around the issue of police accountability?
We have to put accountability pieces into legislation here in the state of Minnesota. Our legislative body has made it so that the law protects the actions of these officers. And sometimes these actions are erroneous actions. Give me a second. Can you hear me?
Yep, everything is perfect. We can see you and hear you fine.
Yeah, some of these actions are heinous acts of violence against young Black men here in this state. A traffic stop, your headlight is out, your blinker's not working, you have a air freshener in your window. These are pretextual stops to gain access to the car, but ultimately what's really happening is these officers are seeing who's in the car and saying that's a Black man driving that car, racially profiling these Black men. And some of these traffic stops turn deadly, and these cars are turning into caskets for some of these young African-American men. Case in point with Philando Sterling and Dante. These are traffic stops. I mean, you should get a ticket and go home. But that's not the case. Even with George Floyd, the funny thing is when Philando died in 2016, when he was murdered in St. Anthony, in Falcon Heights, the buzzwords here in this state were implicit bias training and de-escalation training. That was 2016. But I find it really strange that the field training officer killed George Floyd and the field training officer killed Dante. What are you training these officers is what I'm asking.
I mean, this is a critical point you're making, that the person who is in charge of training the others at the site, Kim Potter, when it came to what happened with Wright, and Derek Chauvin, who is the senior there, who was supposedly training the others. What do you make of this? Because, well, the prosecution, perhaps for other reasons, was making the point that policing is not on trial. Derek Chauvin is.
I wanted to talk about something you asked Sister Nikema Levy-Pound when you asked her about Maxine Waters and her statements here. Me and Nikema Levy-Pound showed up to an officer's home this past summer. This officer has 56 complaints against him over his tenure, 11 successful lawsuits over his tenure, and was involved in 3 police-involved shootings. They voted this man as the president of the Minneapolis Police Federation, and he was promoted to sergeant. So what does that tell you about policing here in this state? We reward bad cops. This and by the way, this guy was also a member of the City Heat, which is a known white supremacist biker gang. But when we show up to his house, the same thing that happened to Maxine Waters happened to me on the campaign trail. I was called a domestic terrorist, Antifa, and he called us mad and angry. We have every right to be angry. We have every right to be mad, and we have every right to use our voices because their actions are what we're protesting against, right? We have a problem here in this state with policing.
Representative Thompson, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that you've been trying to do in the Minnesota House, a committee of the House recently approved your bill that would end qualified immunity for police officers. Why is this particular reform so important to you, and what are the prospects you think of getting it through the whole House and then the tougher job of getting it through the Senate?
Yeah, as a surgeon, as a doctor, you can't mistakenly put morphine in somebody's IV and say, oops, I made a mistake. They're going to walk you out of there in handcuffs. Should be no different for police officers in this state. Legislation in this state has made it possible for bad officers to get away with committing some of these crimes that they're committing in our state, right? So for me, I propose legislation that would actually put some meat on the word reform here. But the problem is our Senate is not hearing any of it. They don't want to hear anything about police reform because either their friends are police officers or they're ex-police officers themselves, and they're catering to these police unions. For the Senate here, they seem to think that the police unions, the Chiefs Association, they get to tell us what reform looks like. And if they don't agree with any provisions we put forth, it won't move through this body.
And what about the relationship between the police union and the legislature? Could you talk more about what you've seen firsthand now that you're in the legislature?
I've seen firsthand the PPP. Police unions punking politicians, firsthand. I've seen it firsthand. Case in point, with me, for instance, I show up to this man's house and I'm being heckled by these patriots. And one of them spit at me. And so I go on this, like, I'm angry and I yell at him and I tell him, if you don't support black people, then, you can Google this stuff. It's me. But I was attacked throughout the entire campaign trail by police union, the Chiefs Federation, and police officers all across this state. And what they did to the Democrats in this state and said, if you if you got a donation from the police unions, they were taking the donations that they'd given you and giving it to the Republican who was running against you in their race. And so that's what we see here with policing in this state, is they play a major role in our elections also. And they make big donations to some of our Republican colleagues who in turn give them exactly what they want when it comes to not voting for reform. Listen, these people got George Floyd killed, they got Philando killed, and they ultimately failed Dante Wright and several others.
Look at the timing. Back July 5th, 2016, Alton Sterling was killed by police in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. You talked to Philando about this as that news came out, and the next day he was killed by police in a suburb of St. Paul. Can you talk about how your then activism on the street what it's meant for you to be in the state assembly right now? But I mean, that is just astounding, from Alton Sterling to Philando, and what you're doing with Philando's mother right now.
If you would have followed me in 2016, I promised the legislative body that we would put people in place to replace them. I also told them that I would be replacing some of the legislators who've been here 22 years uncontested, because a lot of the disparities we see in this state happen on their watch. Legislation created everything that we see as far as disparities in this state, and legislation can fix them. I know what I wanted to see out of my legislator, and so I just became one. Valerie Castile, I don't know if people know this, but right after Philando died, my son was shot 6 times at a funeral. And then I lost my mother. And Valerie Castile has been filling that void as far as a mother's role since then. And so I promised her I'd stick by her side. We just proposed legislation in this state. It was Minnesota House File 784, which would actually take the need for so much public safety out of our communities if they were investing in things that they're not investing in, like jobs and economic development, housing, STEM training, culturally competent tutors and mental health providers. And when I put this bill forth to the body, they told me that this was a racist bill because I'm asking for money for the African American community. This is what I'm up against dealing with our legislation. But here's the thing, is I actually put my name on the ballot hopefully to inspire other young black men like myself to put their name on the ballot. We don't need another rapper in our community. We need people to be legislators, lawyers, doctors, teachers, and everything that we have a void. Every void that we have, we need filled by young black men and women in our state. And so I have to show them, if they see it, they can be it. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm inspiring others to be the change they want to see in the community.
Representative, I wanted to ask you, back in 2017, the officer who killed your friend Philando Sterling was acquitted on charges of manslaughter. What are you watching for in the outcome of the Chauvin trial? And are you hopeful that this time around the justice will be served?
Hey, excuse my French, but I've been a black man all my life. I watched Emmett Till, I watched Rodney King, I watched Philando Sterling, all of their killers walk right out of court and was found ultimately not guilty of the crime that we all know they should have been found guilty of. So there's nothing different here in this state. We are preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. And that's the best I can do as far as this right here. I'm not gonna beat myself up. I'm preparing for a not guilty verdict, to be honest with you.
And what will you do then?
I'll go even harder. I'll go even harder to create the change that we need to see in our community. Listen, there's going to be another police-involved killing in this state this year, simply because we refuse to hear anything about police reform. You got to think about half of these people walked into George Floyd's funeral with VIP tickets, and they had these credentials. I'm talking about people in our legislative body. And then they walked right back into the state capitol and they gave us nothing on police reform. And that was on Juneteenth. Here we are this day and age right now in 2021, in April of 2021, they're still not giving us anything on police reform. They won't even give us hearing. Right now, they're asking for $20 million in our legislative body to bring extra police here to prepare for this verdict. But we can't even get $2 million for culturally intelligent tutors in our community.